Thank you very much, Charles, and good afternoon to all the viewers. It's quite an auspicious time to be talking about South Africa at the moment. It's been quite hectic over the past week or so, and you can see the title is A New Day Dawning. Is it or isn't it? And I will, first of all, set the economic background for you before going into the politics and questioning where we're going. And from the economic background, there is a very simple story to speak about in South Africa. It's a very disappointing story in many ways. The fact is that from 1994 onwards, there was a recovery in the South African, in post-apartheid South Africa for the next 13 years. And the South African economy was able to match the world economy almost point for point. You can see even on this graph from 2008 to around 2013, a very close correlation between what South Africa's economy experienced and what the world economy was doing. We both suffered during the global financial crisis, both recovered thereafter. South Africa held the 2010 FIFA World Cup, and the economy was doing relatively well. In fact, over the period 2004 to 2007, the economy achieved an average annual growth rate of around 5.5% to 6%. But you can see from this graph that from around 2013 onwards, the path between the world economy on the one hand and the South African economy on the other diverge significantly. And you'll notice that South Africa's economy has barely grown since 2013. In fact, on a per capita basis, the GDP is now 6% down. GDP per capita is down 6% compared with a decade ago. In other words, people have, on the whole, got poorer, whilst the rest of the world has carried on growing. And the question to ask, and this goes to the heart of what these elections are all about, actually, ironically, given the result of the election, is what caused that divergence for the worst in South Africa's economy. And the answer is largely attributable to a political change that took place in December 2007, when the ANC held its national elective conference that it holds every 5 years in Polokwane, and had to decide on a new leader of the party. And the incumbent president, Thabo Mbeki at the time, was basically outvoted, and in his place was appointed Jacob Zuma, who had been deputy president, but had been asked to step down from the deputy presidency in 2005 on account of corrupt practices and on account of suggestions that he had been involved in the rape of a woman. Amazingly, that seemed to harness the support of a lot of people to actually overthrow, if I could call it, Mbeki. Now, there's a difference between being president of the party and being president of the country. Mbeki continued being president of the country through most of 2008, but in September of 2008, he was asked to step down and replaced by an interim president for a period of 9 months. One doesn't know what motivated the ANC to go that step. It was just clearly the majority of the party were very much against Mbeki for his style. Even though the economy was doing very well, he was also accused of basically feathering the nests of his cronies, so to speak, who had actually been fairly effective in seeing a post-apartheid recovery in the South African economy. Sadly, we have since realized what the plan of action of the Zuma regime turned out to be. You're really talking about a major change in government between 2008 and 2009. And Zuma appointed people close to him into senior positions of many areas of government. And those people were, on the whole, didn't have much intellectual capacity or competence, but were there in it just for themselves. And we now, in retrospect, realize that there was a grand plan to emaciate many of the country's institutions, which Zuma did amazingly effectively. And a lot of them a lot of that emaciation occurred through the interference with the way in which state-owned enterprises were being run. Now, initially, we didn't think too much of it. The government was set on a recovery path following the global financial crisis and started spending money heavily on not on improving infrastructure, but on expanding the public service and reimbursing public servants generously. And it was only by around 2012, 2013 that the full effects of this started manifesting themselves, and the divergence and the underperformance of the South African economy began appearing very seriously. A lot of the infrastructural programs that should have been undertaken were basically used as a vehicle through which procurement processes were effected that benefited these senior government officials close to Zuma. The most classic, of course, manifestation of that was the manner in which the Gupta family from India virtually bought out Zuma. And they started dictating who should be in what position. And there was a mini crisis at the end of 2015 when they encouraged Zuma to replace the Minister of Finance with one of his own cronies. Big business stepped in and threatened Zuma with a disaster, and Zuma backtracked 4 days later and replaced the Minister of Finance again. But in the process, we saw the rand tumbling from around 13.5 to nearly 17 rand to the dollar in the space of a few days. It was horrific. But little by little, we started realizing and appreciating exactly how much a Zuma regime started damaging the economy. My first inkling into this was in the budget speech in 2013, when the then Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan, spoke about there is no reason why the government should be spending 28 rand to buy a loaf of bread when you can go into a shop in town and buy it for 8 rand per loaf of bread. And I didn't think too much about it, but we realized that kind of experience started replicating itself many times over in the ensuing years, to the extent that by the time the re-election of the president cropped up in 2017, December 2017, there was a very heated contestation between Zuma's candidate, which was his former wife, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and Cyril Ramaphosa, who had been his deputy president. Throughout this period, and this is one of the criticisms of Ramaphosa, is he didn't actually raise his voice against many of the corrupt practices, but he has since defended himself by saying it was impossible to do so, and he thought that he could achieve more by keeping silent and ultimately becoming president. The fact is that he inherited a declining economy, and he set about trying to ameliorate many of these institutions. The frustration that people have had is they have felt that he has gone about it far too slowly and far too leniently, and not come down sufficiently on those convicted of corruption. The fact is that he has achieved certain successful goals, such as improving the National Prosecuting Authority, returning the South African Revenue Services to a reputable institution that started collecting taxes properly rather than enabling Zuma's friends to get away without paying taxes, and to ameliorate and restore the integrity of the National Treasury, the Ministry of Finance, after the decimation of that institution and the resignation of many very capable officials. But it's been a long haul, and the economy has not really recovered ever since. Next slide. You will see, for example, that The forecast for the South African economy by the International Monetary Fund right now for growth of just under 1% this year and 1.2% next year are amongst the lowest growth rates of the G20 countries. And in fact, you might say they're better than forecasts for British growth and Eurozone growth. But then you've got to bear in mind that those regions have virtually no population growth, whereas South Africa's population is growing at 1.6% per annum. So it's a rather sad story that we see. If we go on to the next slide, you will see that since South Africa suffered obviously significantly from the COVID crisis in 2020, but I've tried to show you the three main elements of this decline and the recovery thereafter. And what you see is that employment has only recently come back to levels that prevailed prior to the COVID crisis. The GDP is only just higher than it was then. But the saddest part is gross fixed capital formation or capital investment has been very weak throughout the past decade. And that reflects the decimation of the economy and the diversion of resources away from where they should have been going to the pockets of a fairly small group of individuals. Next slide. What was clearly economically destructive was the fact that consumer spending all this while kept edging upwards and has remained stronger, and you can see is now at levels above those that prevailed prior to the COVID crisis. But capital investment fell precipitously from 2014 all the way through 2020, and it recovered from mid-2021 through to mid-2023, but has since fallen off once again. Next slide. And as a percentage of GDP, capital investment is now below 15%. It was down to 13%. It had been as high as 24% in 2008 and 19% in 2014. But you can see this actually shows you what the manner in which what is called state capture, the corruption within the Zuma regime, what that led to. Ramaphosa has tried to alleviate this, but has been only marginally successful. Next slide. You can see from here how the gap between private sector investment and investment by the public sector has just widened enormously. And what we see, especially with the black line, which is public corporations, state-owned enterprises, how their investment levels have actually contracted by around 50% over the past decade. And that has been at the heart of the problems that we have had in energy generation and transport and logistics. Next slide. Fortunately, in the recent months, we can see that the extent of electricity outages has plummeted back to nearly zero. And that is what some people see as the potential start of the new dawn, that if we now no longer have these energy shortages, then surely economic growth will start accelerating. But it's still very early days for that to happen. And many people were extremely skeptical and thinking that as soon as the elections were over, we would start seeing what is known as load shedding resuming. But next slide. But what has also helped enormously is that the private sector has stepped in the way it has done on so many other occasions to make up for the absence of competence in the public sector to do its own investing. And there's been a huge spate of investment in solar energy in the last, and solar panels in the past couple of years, that has alleviated much of the energy crisis. Next slide. And similarly, on the transport and logistics front, you can see the decimation in this graph of the railroad system in South Africa over the last 7-8 years, as projects and tenders were issued to friends of Zuma, who basically pocketed the money and didn't supply the energy, the delivery of the infrastructure that it ought to. And this has compelled the country to shift massively towards road transport as a means of freight, and that has been damaging our roads, exacerbating situations still further. Next slide. The last few months, again, have provided a little bit of hope. You can see how there's starting to be a rebuilding of the rail network, mainly because Ramaphosa has taken the bullet by the horns and smothered his ideologically socialist colleagues and allowed the private sector to step in to start rejuvenating the railroad network of the country, which is still fundamentally in place, but has just been left to decay. And so there is an opportunity to start rejuvenating that railroad network without too much expenditure. And we see the port network, where the amount of containers going through our ports has declined progressively over the last 5 years, how we're starting to see a little bit of a recovery there as well, mainly as a result of a change in the leadership of Transnet in the last few months that has started encouraging more work to be done. Next slide. The retail sector is finally feeling a pinch. I mentioned how consumer spending had managed to continue increasing through the first decade of the Zuma regime, but now you can see how retail sales have just flattened out in the last few years. Interest rates, next slide, have had to rise quite significantly, partly in line with what is happening in the rest of the world due to inflationary pressures that arose following the end of COVID. And that is eating into people, finally starting to affect consumer spending as well, which is barely growing, if at all. Thank you. Next slide. Let us turn now to, so that is where the economy sits when we enter the political framework. Now, so many have been arguing that in order for the country to reverse its long-term economic decline, we have to have a change in the leadership of the government. And we see the effects of the economic decline in the latest figures to some extent in the fall of the support for the ANC from 57.5% of the total vote in 2019 to 40.2% in the last week's elections. The Democratic Alliance has remained the leading opposition party, and it is comprised of more private sector-oriented interests, and is accused by many in the population of being white-controlled, even though the population of whites in South Africa is now just 6.9% of the total, and the Democratic Alliance has managed to get 22% of the vote, which tells you that many blacks are starting to support the Democratic Alliance. But the big surprise of these latest elections was the resurrection of a Zuma faction to take 14.6% of the vote, concentrated very heavily in KwaZulu-Natal. And that highlights one of the features of the latest election that is a little concerning, and that is polarization along ethnic lines. Zulus voted in heavily for Zuma, and further down you see PA, the Patriotic Alliance, in the concentrated in the Western Cape, where this ex-convict Gayton McKenzie has basically developed a political party that aims at fighting gangsterism and taking a hard line again on immigration, etc., but to protect the colored community, the Cape colored community. So in many respects, one is a bit concerned about the rise in the ethnic polarization of the country. But Therein lies the very reason why South Africa remains a relatively stable society, because there is such a diversity of race and tribe that no individual tribe can really take over and assume power for itself entirely. It'll run into a lot of opposition from other parties. And that differentiates South Africa a lot from many other African countries and is a source of strength. I have frequently questioned why the South African economy has not collapsed in the face of all these headwinds: no energy, no poor transport, for declining, deteriorating transport and logistics, as well as increasing water delivery problems that we're having. It's another one that I haven't actually mentioned. But there we have now a situation where, after 30 years of having more than 50% of the vote and being able to dominate government, the ANC is now being forced into seeking a coalition with other political parties. What are the options? To put the ideological framework around this, the ANC is what they call a broad church. In other words, you've got people who are market-oriented, but also ideologues who are communists and socialists, all within the same party. And the party has therefore struggled all along the line of the clash between these two ideologies within its own ranks. Now, the Democratic Alliance is firmly in favor of a market economy and liberal values. So too, the majority of the other parties that you see in this list, the smaller parties, with but the notable exceptions are MK, that Zuma is leading. He says that he's fighting for the rights of the poor, even though he's basically robbed them of their livelihoods. And that's one of the biggest ironies of the support that he derives. And that's why I say that there is a very strong ethnic element to the support that he is deriving. And the Economic Freedom Front, that was spawned by this firebrand called Julius Malema just over 10 years ago. And it seemed to be gaining a lot of ground, but has now plateaued and actually lost out quite a lot of its support to the MK group. The IFP is a smaller Zulu group that is moderate and has been a key smaller player in the South African political environment since democracy and under its erstwhile late leadership of the late Mangosuthu Buthelezi. So they are in a way a kingpin in the coalition talks with their 3.9% vote that can swing either way. Now, what it does mean is the ANC has the choice of linking up with MK or the EFF and getting back to over 50%. Ironically, it can no longer just link up only with the EFF, because that would leave it still below 50%. But importantly, it can link up with its former colleagues in MK who have sided with Zuma rather than Ramaphosa. Or alternatively, it can look towards the center and tie up with the Democratic Alliance, the DA, and as well as a lot of the other smaller parties, such as the Freedom Front plus the ACDP, the African Christian Democratic Party, Action SA, etc. And that is the contestation that currently exists. Now, if we go on to the next slide, why is this? Now, this is the breakdown in terms of parliamentary votes. I think I better not spend too long about it, but you can see that the ANC has now come down from 230 out of the 400 seats in parliament to just 159. And the MK group of Zuma has suddenly taken 58 of the seats. It does mean that the many members of the ANC are suddenly going to lose their jobs and be impoverished as a consequence. And that speaks to one of the reasons why people have been very cynical about the ANC and seeing that politicians are in that organization simply to make a living out of being politicians rather than contributing to the economy as a whole, which the private sector has managed to keep going and is mainly supportive of the DA and some of the other smaller parties. If we go on to the next slide. One other feature, just to highlight that, illustrating the disillusionment with the ANC's rule, is the manner in which the voter turnout has just deteriorated, especially over the past decade. And many of the youth are disillusioned and just don't bother voting because they say, what purpose will it serve? But in the end, the latest results suggest that it may well serve a purpose and result in a change, a transformation of the government, hopefully for the better. Or is it for the worst? Next slide. And this is what we need to question. And it's been fascinating just to observe the volatility and the movements in the Rand's exchange rate in the last few days, almost on an hour-to-hour basis, depending on the news flow, which points in which direction the ANC might go in terms of aligning itself with either the populist MK and EFF. They support, for example, land expropriation without compensation, the funding of national health insurance scheme that is theoretically totally unaffordable. Yeah. Britons would know more about that in many ways than South Africans. Funding of a basic income grant to give every man, woman, and child in South Africa 1,000 Rand a month, which is also basically unaffordable, but also to embark upon massive government spending to uplift the people, and with the risk that we would see a massive increase in the public debt, and with that, a collapse in confidence from the outside world and investor communities. The currency would plummet to well over 20 Rand to the dollar. Inflation would soar, interest rates would have to be raised, and economic growth would collapse. That is the one alternative that is being offered. The second alternative is, next slide, the alliance with the more centrist organizations, such as the Democratic Alliance, and with some of the other parties possibly, forming a government of national unity with the centrist parties, and having the populists of MK and EFF, who together would account for 24% of the vote, being the official opposition. And this is, of course, the line of thinking that many of South Africa's business allies and its own businessmen are really wanting to see happen. It would result in more active embrace of the private sector rather than the command economy that we have been having for many years. And it would also see many of these different parties exerting effective oversight over the ANC, so that corruption could well start being stemmed as a consequence of such a combination. It's also, many of these smaller parties are in it for the betterment of the country, for the national interest rather than for their own benefit, because many of them weren't even sure that they would ever get to Parliament, get enough votes to be in Parliament. Nonetheless, I think it would still take a lot of effort to restructure the economy in such a way as to lift growth. And one would also be dealing with quite a lot of egos in terms of the leadership of some of these smaller parties that would have to be overcome. They would all have to compromise to form this kind of coalition. But it's been so fascinating to note that whenever there's been talk of this, the Rand has appreciated, and whenever there's been a sense of disappointment with the direction in which the talks are going, the concept of more power for the MK and the EFF in the future political spectrum, the Rand has actually suffered considerably. Either way, I think there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, certainly with the former scenario of an ANC type with the MK and the EFF, we could well see a disastrous fall in the currency in almost a case of days if that were to materialize. But with this second alternative of a grand alliance of centrist parties, one would probably see very much a wait-and-see attitude of a little bit of confidence, but not too much until this alliance proved that it could actually work well. So in this case, one would see probably the continuation of economic growth of 1 to 2% for the next year or two before, hopefully, and this is the new dawn we're talking about, you'd get enough action taken to address the structural weaknesses of the economy to start seeing a lift up in economic growth from about 2027 onwards. So those are the two scenarios that we're sitting in right now. Now, in which direction are we going? There are a number of issues that I think one needs to bear in mind. A very fundamental one that I picked up over the weekend. Ramaphosa, both in his State of the Nation address in February, as well as in his post-election speech on Sunday night, emphasized passionately his desire for the maintenance of democratic principles and adherence to the sanctity of our constitution, which he himself helped to draft, which has been a very powerful constitution protecting human rights and the rights of people in many, many different ways. Interestingly, John Steenhuisen, the leader of the Democratic Alliance, had spoken 1 hour earlier, given a press conference briefing, in which he also said the Democratic Alliance will only enter into an alliance with parties that had similar values for defense of the Constitution and democratic principles. Immediately, I realized that the very fundamental principles that both the ANC under Ramaphosa and the Democratic Alliance pursue are the same. And therefore, there is a wonderful opportunity for them to come together based on those fundamental principles. And there are many of the other smaller parties that I think would align themselves with that. On the other side, you've got the MK that has stipulated as a prerequisite for entering into talks with the ANC, with the need for talking to a leader of the organization other than Cyril Ramaphosa. In other words, they want Cyril Ramaphosa to resign. There is an absolute hatred that has developed between Ramaphosa and Zuma. And it is for these reasons that I believe theoretically one ought to see the second, more favorable scenario panning out rather than the first one. But one is gathering through the media and social media that there's a lot of dissension within the ANC under Ramaphosa in terms, their heart tells them that they still belong with MK and EFF and these populist struggle stalwarts. Their brain tells them that it's much more effective, going to be much more effective for the country as a whole to have a more centrist approach. But then the trade unions are going to be right in the middle. They won't know which way to go. So it's not an easy way out. And there has been talk, for example, of the possibility that we may, in fact, even have a minority government of the ANC, with the Democratic Alliance demanding that it have, even though it may not be in alliance directly with the ANC, that it be given certain oversight positions, such as Speaker of the Parliament and chairmanships of the portfolio committees of each individual segment of the economy and society, that would give it the ability to control corrupt activities within the ANC. So I remain fairly hopeful, but I just saw before coming on air that the Rand suddenly fell quite a bit in the last hour or two. And then I saw a headline that the ANC in its executive was talking about a government of national unity without stipulating who Now, if that government of national unity were still to include everyone, well, we wouldn't make any progress, because it would mean, again, a complete an environment where there was complete dissension between the ideologues on the left and those who were pursuing a market-oriented economy. So we've got to wait to see what happens. I'm optimistic, however, that the fundamental tendency will move us towards the second scenario that is more favorable. Next slide. One can see, for example, that the exchange rate of the rand has actually depreciated significantly in the last 2 years in anticipation of the uncertainty surrounding the elections, but has stabilized more recently and gained a little bit of ground. And that is a reflection of the fact that previous fears of us definitely going the populist route have been tempered to the realization that we may be now starting to move towards an alliance of the center that could be much more constructive. Very interestingly, the South African economy in the last month has suddenly taken over its erstwhile position as the biggest economy in Africa. Why? Because we have a relatively stable currency, ironically, compared with Nigeria and Egypt, who have suffered enormous devaluations, so that in dollar terms, their GDPs have now fallen well below South Africa's GDP. Next slide. The other point to make is that the rand is itself still at a very weak level, and a lot of the bad news has already been built into the currency. You can see that on a trade-weighted basis, adjusted for inflation, the rand is close to its lowest levels of the last 30 years. And there are some other positives, next slide, that one can look towards. For example, the inflation rate has managed to come down now to a level of 5.1%, which is very much in line with the inflation rates of the average for the world. So it shows that our monetary policy has been very disciplined, and interest rates are relatively high relative to inflation to maintain that discipline. The EFF are calling for the nationalization of the central bank, and that would go the other way. Next slide. That would take us the other way. Also, of course, one of the big problems is the rise in the public debt, which has soared in recent years to over 70% of GDP. And that is a source of concern, and has, next slide, seen the country's credit rating being downgraded significantly. Our budget deficit in the very short term has got smaller, which is quite favorable, again, supportive of a slightly firmer rand. Next slide. There we are. There's the credit ratings. And you can see how progressively under the Zuma regime, from the time of Zuma took over as president, where we were 3 notches above the into investment grade, we've now moved to 3 notches below investment grade in the ensuing time, because of the fear that you're going to have a populist government that overspends. So that is why it's so critical. We're on a knife edge in knowing which way the ANC is going to move in this regard. One piece of good news is that the incumbent Minister of Finance says that he's prepared to serve under a future government stay in that position. And he has overseen, as you saw, a reduction in the budget deficit more recently, which is good news. Next slide. Also favoring us is an improvement in the trade balance. The country has been running a trade surplus now for the last 3 years, and that has improved a little again. The trade surplus did fall, soared and then fell, mainly on the back of a surge in international coal prices and platinum group metal prices in 2022. Then they tumbled in 2023, but there's been a bit of a recovery since then. Next slide. Just to put things into perspective, you can see the light blue line that I've tried to highlight is South Africa's public debt to GDP in relation to that of many other advanced economies. And at 75% of GDP, you suddenly realize that South Africa's debt to GDP ratio is nowhere near as bad as that of the UK or the United States, or if we were still Italy or Japan. Next slide. The problem is that this fear of a populist government has resulted in people assigning a very high risk premium to investing in South African debt when it is issued. Our long-term interest rates, 10-year yields, are over 6% above the inflation rate. That is one of the highest real yields in the world, and is the penalty that South Africa is paying for the uncertainty surrounding its political and economic future related to whether we're going to see a populist or a more conservative economic regime going forward. Next slide. For all these reasons, I believe that the Rand has already taken a big pounding and is unlikely to depreciate very much further in the short to medium term, unless we do see an unequivocal tie-up between the ANC and the EFF and MK, whereafter we would see the Rand plunging to well over 20 to the dollar and 25 to the pound in next to no time. But my own hunch, as I've mentioned, is I put the probabilities more on the centrist alliance being formed of sorts. There will be problems, but they will not be catastrophic, and the country has faced a lot more headwinds in the past. I think I have said enough, and I'm happy to take questions thereafter.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Azar. That was really excellent. We've got a number of questions. We've probably got about 10 minutes left, so we'll see what happens now. If anyone would like to ask questions, then please do. Just add them to the screen on your right. There's a question here about the Rand and the US dollar going in the case of the market-friendly coalition or the market-unfriendly coalition. Even if there is a market-friendly one, will South Africa continue to go through slow burn and decay?
I think my message was initially you would hope there'd still be a lot of problems. You saw from the real exchange rate that the country's currency is undervalued. Therefore, theoretically, it could appreciate easily back to 16, maybe even less than that, to the dollar if suddenly there was a resurgence of optimism. But I think there will be still far too much uncertainty to countenance such a steep appreciation. And I would say be looking, as our forecasts suggest, at a range somewhere between 17.5 and 19.5 to the dollar for the foreseeable future. But in the event of a populist resolution to this whole problem, next to no time we would end up with the way of Venezuela and some of these other populist regimes. Zimbabwe is the worst case, I suppose, Turkey, and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a political question here, perhaps a conspiracy theory. Is there any substance to the rumour that the ANC was heading for bankruptcy and that it was effectively bailed out by Iran in return for South Africa bringing the case against Israel in the ICC?
I don't know what you mean by bankruptcy. To the extent that the government is short of cash, no question about it. But you saw our public debt to GDP ratio, 75% of GDP, which is lower than that of many advanced economies. I know one needs to add some of the debt of the state-owned enterprises to that, and you'd get closer to a figure of around 85% of GDP. In practice, some would say that is the more realistic share, but that is not close to bankruptcy. The other thing to bear in mind is that much or most of South Africa's government debt is acquired through investment in bonds by South African financial institutions, not by foreigners. And that is a source of incredible financial strength. It means that we don't have to repay much debt in foreign currency, so that even if the currency does depreciate, we don't have to, we are not in dire straits. There is some foreign debt that would escalate in rand value were the rand to depreciate sharply, but it's a fairly small proportion compared with many Latin American and other countries who rely on foreign money more than local money to fund their. There's also another, ironically, a short-term factor that is alleviating the debt situation in South Africa. Because of the depreciation of the rand, the South African Central Bank has been owning a lot of reserves in dollars and euros and pounds over many years, and it has made a capital gain of around 500 billion rand. And the government has found it propitious, under pressure from the left, to use a small part of that, about 150 billion, to actually reduce the public debt for the coming year or so. And obviously one doesn't want to see that process continuing indefinitely, and the government, as a Reserve Bank, central bank, has made it quite clear that it won't countenance a raid of that capital gain too far. But for the moment, there is this surplus available to actually tap into.
Okay. What do you think about a coalition between the ANC and the Democratic Alliance in terms of racial and wealth inequalities in South Africa?
Obviously, it would be a fairly tense relationship in many ways, partly because of the history of the country. Many within the ANC see the Democratic Alliance as a white-dominated party, which is belied by the data because, as I mentioned, you've got 6.9% of the population is white, and yet the Democratic Alliance has 22% of the vote, which tells you that the majority of people voting for the Democratic Alliance are voting for it because of its policies of investor-friendly and rule of law and adherence to the Constitution. But there would be a contestation over issues such as land expropriation without compensation, the National Health Insurance Scheme. The Democratic Alliance has already come out and said there are certain red lines that it refuses to cross, and those are them. The issue of black economic empowerment that it disagrees with, the issue of minimum wage legislation that it also disagrees with and sees as an impediment to employment creation. There would need to be compromises in terms of the approach if they were to be in alliance. And this is where there may be an inclination within the Democratic Alliance not to get into a formal alliance with the ANC, but rather to just be assigned certain oversight roles over a minority government.
Okay, there's a question here about the brain drain and what's going to happen there. And obviously, is this going to be exacerbated depending on what government comes out?
Without a doubt, I think the brain drain would be exacerbated by a populist alliance being formed. There has already been a massive brain drain from South Africa, estimated to be about 1 million people over the past, since the beginning of the century. And most of them, of course, are skilled persons, and the country is bleeding skills as a consequence. So it is a very detrimental potential development. But as I said, and I would concur that were there to be an alliance with the MK and EFF, one would see an acceleration of emigration of skilled people. And by the way, that immigration is no longer confined to white persons alone. It's people of all colors, and you see it in many of your own societies, South Africans of color who are educated working in your countries. Yes.
Okay, a question here about the Democratic Alliance. I mean, as a junior partner in a coalition, will it be weakened, as happened to, for example, the Liberals here in the UK when they joined the Conservatives?
The experience of the Liberals is a classic warning sign for the Democratic Alliance. And I was listening to an interview on Saturday with the chairperson of the Democratic Alliance, Helen Ziller, and she was saying, absolutely, there are huge risks to the Democratic Alliance going into an alliance with the ANC, alluding to this kind of potential. But she said, you know, the motto of the Democratic Alliance going into the elections was rescue South Africa. She says, if we're not prepared to take a risk to rescue the country, then we are not sticking to our principles, which to our goals, which is to try and do something for the sake of the country and not worry first and foremost about the future of the party alone.
What do you think the ANC and the Democratic Alliance have in common? Because in some ways the ANC is more aligned with the more radical parties historically.
Well, it depends who of the ANC you're referring to. And this is the crux that I try to get to by saying what the ANC and the DA have in common is that ANC, under the leadership of Ramaphosa officially, are committed very strongly to the pursuit of democratic principles and the respect for a constitution that South Africans have been very proud of over the last 30 years. And that's a very fundamental basis of working together, I would have thought. If I may say, what has been so satisfying, and there was an air of euphoria over the last week, similar to the one that we had 30 years ago. Yes, there's nervousness, but also euphoria. There is a lot of patriotism and a feeling that democracy is alive and well in South Africa, and so strong, and is operating in a very strong manner, in a manner that is the envy of many other countries in the world. And given the reasons for why you're also seeing a lot of social stability, notwithstanding high unemployment and so on, because there is such diversity within society, everyone recognizes that they can't do it alone, that they have to work with people who are different from them.
Okay, can I ask one final question? That is really, will Zuma become a loyal opposition, or rather a democratic opposition to the ANC if he's not chosen, or what will he do?
I think there is a good chance that he will try to be a disruptor. Yeah. But in the same way as I've said, and I've seen why, and we had the most classic example of this with the unrest that was experienced in July 2021, which one now realizes was very much driven by the Zuma faction. And why did the rest of the country not join in? It was really confined mainly to KwaZulu-Natal and a few parts of the Gauteng region where Zulus come to work. And it didn't spread to the rest of the country. Other tribes, the Xhosas, the Shongans, the Tswanas, the Pedis, they are frightened and would rather side with other parties than actually join in any disruption that Zuma were to instigate.
Okay. I think that's just about all for now. Do you have any final comments or any forecasts or anything else like that?
I think I've given you some of the forecasts. I am cautiously optimistic. I think that summarizes my view.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We're very, very grateful that you not only covered the economy, but also the politics as well. Sarah, I know, is very grateful for your assistance in this, and we hope and wish South Africa and also Sarah very well. And we will send out the presentation tomorrow afternoon, late tomorrow afternoon, and we'll be back to you when we next have more an idea of what we're going to be doing next. So thank you very much, everyone. Many thanks, and have a good afternoon.
Goodbye.